Welcome to the Asia Climate Finance Podcast, where our host and expert guests delve into and scrutinise the pressing issues and emerging trends in climate business and climate finance. We greatly appreciate your support. Please like, review and subscribe to the podcast to help us grow and reach a wider audience. Be sure to take note of the disclaimers at the conclusion of each show. And now, here is your host, investor, analyst and author, Joseph Giacobelli.
Hello there, and welcome back to the Asia Climate Finance Podcast. In episode 53, we continue our fascinating conversation with Professor Christine Loh, one of Asia's preeminent thinkers on the environment and climate change. As Chief Development Strategist at the Institute of the Environment at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, HKUST, one of the world's leading universities, Professor Loh brings a wealth of experience to our discussion. As mentioned previously, Professor Loh has an unparalleled background, so please be sure to check out her unique bio in the show notes. In this second part, we evaluate climate policy and climate action in the Chinese mainland and Hong Kong, examining the issues from a policy perspective. Given China's crucial role in global climate action, we began by discussing the nation's policies related to the environment, climate change, and energy. I hope you enjoy the second part of the discussion.
Well, let me start with China because that's the 1,000-pound gorilla.
Yes.
And my specialty is China's policy related to the environment and to climate change, energy, in that area. I have been tracking Chinese policies relating to the environment for, 25 years. Mm-hmm. And I followed it at the beginning, not because I was an academic, but because I was in the private sector. And one of my first paid jobs was really in natural resources, in commodities. Mm-hmm. And that gave me a sense of what natural resources are like, where they come from, how do you exploit them, the trade, the pricing, of commodities. So I'm rooted there. But my academic background is in the law, so I'm kind of trawling around the real kind of commodities world with a kind of legal background. But because I got interested in politics and policy, I also look at systems, countries, economies, through the lens of how do they make decisions. And when I was in the commercial world, one of the things I found to be extremely useful in doing business, I was doing international commodities business, but physical business, not just the paper pushing side. I need to kind of understand how these different places make decisions. So, for example, China was the first country I had to go and deal with, and then I worked in Indonesia and some other places. And the framework that I developed for myself is, well, what's the policy? I mean, what is my counterpart? So China is particularly interesting with that because it's a very state-driven economy. And when I was in commodities, I would be trading commodities with the import-export, the relevant import-export companies, which are all state-owned. So the first thing that comes across is, okay, what's your current policy with these kinds of products, or with trade, or with your currency, and so on? So I guess because of my own experience, particularly relating to the China market, I always ask, well, what's the government trying to do? To what extent have they articulated any plans, any targets, and so on? And because it's such a big country, what are they trying to do with these products, or maybe this particular province? Or what are they trying to do? So I've developed a framework for myself to kind of understand China. And when I was no longer trading commodities, I was in public policy. And so I asked the same sort of questions. What is China trying to do? So fast forward to today, my framework is to always go to what I call first principles of understanding China. How policies are made, where is it made, why are they doing this, for example, in their energy policy, or what are they doing in biodiversity? They know they have a lot of pollution or degradation. Where's their policy now and why? Who are the main players? Have they got a longer-term view? And how are they financing it, right? So you ask all the sort of fundamental questions. Well, today, or rather, I find tracking China more and more exciting. Because what I've seen over the years is China finally kind of said, I've got to clean up, otherwise I could never be somebody in the world, right? You know, we want to grow. GDP is really important. We want to get out of poverty. But boy, you know, I've polluted my whole country. We can't breathe the air. We can't drink the water. That's not good. Now, we also, since 2012, had a new leader in Xi Jinping. And whatever people say about Xi Jinping, he's a greenie. And when he came on the scene, you know, I looked at his previous writings. Well, he's a very green person. Wherever he had gone, he'd left a positive environmental policy. So you can kind of say, okay, here's a leader. He cares about this. And you track it as it goes along, and you track the Chinese system, which is part of also a more imperial kind of administrative system where they have many thinkers and researchers that are attached to ministries and these state-owned enterprises, to research institutes and so on. So there's a lot of thinking power at the central level and some at the provincial level. So once I think China decided, right, decarbonization, you know, that is important for us. And it's important for us because that's the way to grow. We believe in this because the Chinese never had a period of time where they think climate change was a hoax. They always took the data and the science quite seriously. So they've broken through, you know, it's one of the few countries that have a very clear pathway to decarbonization. And they use the same kind of policy-making structure in other policy areas. You know, so I could describe to people, and many people do ask these questions, how does China make policy? And once you have the 101 down pat, you can then use illustrations and say, you see, in this area, you know, this is what they did. In that area, that is what they did. And you kind of track it. The Chinese generally tell you what they're going to do because they have 5-year plans, they have national plans, and because the country is big, when they make these plans, one of the things they have to do is sell it to the country. You know, so you have many public documents and regulatory guidelines and all kinds of things, right? You read those, you get a pretty good idea what China says it wants to do. Now, that then makes it easy for a researcher to then follow those guidelines and targets and so on and say, well, how have they done? You can look back and see how they've done. How do they go backwards and then maybe go forwards? If they run into a problem, what is the problem? What's the cause of that problem? Do they still want to go forward, or are they dropping the policy? You know, then you can see where they're not dropping the policy, but they have to make adjustments here and there.
So if you take a snapshot, Professor Loh, of today, where we are at today, and obviously, you know, all countries need to do more. I mean, China, India, US, Europe, everybody needs to do a lot more. Now that we're going to miss sadly, the 1.5. But if you were to take a snapshot of China today, policy-wise, I think there isn't a very good global understanding of what's going on, because one thing that China doesn't do a lot is publicize its policies, for lack of a better expression. So where do you see the policies today? I mean, are they more advanced than others? Are they behind the curve? Or?
Actually, I have to disagree with that. They tell you everything they're going to do. I mean, the information that I have are all published. Mm-hmm. And many of the key documents are also have translated version. And today, with translation being so easy, you can do it yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is, the Chinese, if you track them, they tell you everything that they're going to do. Mm-hmm. And that's not actually difficult. The Chinese have their way of writing policy documents, and they do it in a way that I think very often people outside China may misunderstand. They always start with principles, and when you read their 5-year plan or you read their, whatever new regulations and guidelines, you'd say, well, it sounds pretty general, and there are just a few targets, how do I make sense of this? Well, you got to track what they do. The Chinese always comes up with the broadest possible principles. And then you find over the successive months, they publish more and more details about implementation. So once you understand what it is like, it's actually not very hard to track. So I'd suggest to people who are interested in China, just use this way of finding out. The other barrier that I think some people have is they can't quite get past the language barrier. You don't want to read a 60-page document, but frankly, if you're in any other parts of the world, some other documents are also quite long. Yes. I think the media, maybe the suspicion that for example, maybe in the West, that you just can't take China too seriously, is still maybe there, but that actually is long past. And, if we wanted to go back and test the system, well, we can go back to the 10th 5-year plan, and say, well, did they meet these various targets? They have had energy white papers. Are they following that pathway? So you can go back a number of years and then track them forward. And I think people will find that China is fairly consistent. They kind of set a North Star and say, okay, we're going that way. And yes, sometimes there are things in the middle that are challenges and is slower or quicker or whatever, is a bit of a mess, but they keep going in that direction. The other thing about China is they don't have electoral cycles. They don't have combative politics, so that they can do 5-year plan. And in fact, they're always planning at least 10 years. So once you understand that system, I like to think people can follow China much more easily.
So going back to the original question, which is, if you take a snapshot of today, where are we at? Are we in China? I mean, are we more in some areas more advanced, or in other areas more behind, or how would you assess it in terms of the key areas?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by advanced. So I always say, whichever economy we're talking about, I'd say, well, number one, has this economy got a pathway to reach their target? Because pretty much all the countries in the world are going for 2050 carbon neutrality, or 2060 or 2070, right? You have China 2060, you have India 2070, you have the great majority of them 2050, and I think you have 1 or 2 countries like Norway or Denmark that have targets, before 2050. Now, have they got an actual pathway? Which of the countries can actually say, I now have a pathway and my pathway looks like this? China is one of the few that has a very clear pathway. And I think for people who understands, engineering and technology and, the policy choices, you will see that China is very pragmatic country. And it makes certain major choices, like it made choices 25, 30 years ago that China had to grow. China has a big, big population. They need a lot of energy. And so if you can imagine the Chinese leaders 25, let's say, years ago, they need a lot of energy. how would you decide if you were in their place, right? So what they decided at the time was, okay, because we need so much energy to grow, we're not going to go for any particular type of energy. We're going to use coal because that's what we have, and we are going to keep investing in nuclear, and we're not going to close our minds to any type of energy technology and energy sources. So, okay, that makes sense. So if you take this and still continue to go forward, well, they're also not giving up on any of the new energies, the hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, carbon capture, right? They're continuing to go with that. But one thing I think is always interesting to look at is coal. So coal for them represents energy security. That is the base of using coal to grow. So about 15 years ago, it was pretty clear that coal was bad for climate change. And you have two views, in a way, in China saying, well, we have to use less coal. But the coal people were saying, well, yes, but the fact is we are still going to have to rely on coal for a very long time. So therefore, as the coal sector, we're going to continue to invest in technology to make our technology the cleanest, i.e. the most efficient. So you come up with the super ultra critical coal technology. And I was privileged enough to witness one of these debates at the time in China. It was totally fascinating, where the coal sector said, we're going to have to rely on coal for a long time. So therefore, we have to keep pushing the technology to be more and more efficient. And also, there are many other developing countries out there in the same position, where coal is what they have. So they're going to use coal, because otherwise they can't develop. So this technology that we're developing will be useful for them as whatever you do in the future, right? And 15 years ago, China didn't have all the renewables, and they were not looking at new energies yet. So you can see, I think the Chinese decision was the right one on a very practical basis. Now, also because their engineering, their technology had advanced a lot, they have a lot more choices. And with their very efficient supply chain, they can make solar panels now costing nothing. And whatever we say about overcapacity, they've messed themselves up. These big solar panel companies are losing money. That's all true. But what it is you have very cheap solar panels that you can plaster all over China, and you can sell it to many other countries that need it right now.
And can benefit from it at a very low price.
Well, that's right. So I see China, I see the telling of this story, how they got here. And, we don't always have to make a judgment call on, whether the Chinese is good or bad. We can just tell the story and say, how did it get there? I think that's the most fascinating part. And then what will China do going forward? We can follow the policy, we can follow the companies. And of course, I'm a bit of a geek, and I do find understanding the choices that were made to be very interesting and compelling for other economies that are now trying to look and say, well, what should I do?
So one clear, in my language, my own personal definition, a bit more advanced area is the fact that they've got very reasonably clear planning. They have this pathway. What about when it comes to regulation, and especially at the corporate side? We're talking about climate reporting, or just companies issuing sustainability or whatever it is, ESG reports together with especially the listed companies. Where are we at there? Are we comparable to kind of the EU, which has been arguably a leader when it comes to climate reporting, or are we behind? Or
I think the Chinese companies are getting into the act. So I think if we wanted to say, okay, which are the Chinese companies that are doing a reasonably good job, right? So the one that I've been putting out there to ask people to look at is China Mobile. And China Mobile was a company that I knew somewhat and watched somewhat over the years. They, at one time, had a chairman who really wanted to do well in these areas. So they've kind of developed a practice of going forward. And I think different major state-owned enterprises, because the state said, look, you all got to do it. I mean, they're all kind of getting into the act. And because the Chinese regulators have said environmental reporting, you know, you've got to all do it. It's happening. And, you know, you give China a few more years, they'll all do better. So I think if you're taking China as a whole, if you're comparing it with the best in the EU, well, of course, I think the Europeans are much, much further along. If you're comparing China with many other places in the world, I think China is, you know, not doing so bad. And again, looking at Hong Kong is interesting. Hong Kong...
I was going to ask you about that next.
Right. I mean, Hong Kong has a handful of companies, one you know very well, where they took a decision 15 or more years ago that they wanted to do this. And these handful of companies in Hong Kong that have been doing reporting, I think are among some of the best. You know, they measure up to the best in the world. And that's something Hong Kong, little Hong Kong, you know, can be proud of. But then you're also seeing in Hong Kong, how are you getting everybody else up there? So again, in the end, because this reporting has been going on for quite a long time on a voluntary basis, finally the stock exchange can say, okay, you know, everybody has to do this kind of reporting. The regulators are saying, okay, ISSB, you know, you all have to do it by a certain date. So that you've kind of prepared the ground. Nobody can say, you haven't given me lots of time. And of course, I think also in the Hong Kong market, the professional services are kind of there to help these companies to get on. So there has been an explosion of interest and actual practical doing it for all the listed companies.
So Hong Kong, we're getting, especially the professional services, basically best global practice. But so we're getting the companies kind of like raising their game when it comes to disclosure, reporting, et cetera, et cetera. But then we can talk a little bit about policy here in Hong Kong, because I've got fond memories of, oh God, I think it was maybe 10, 15 or 20 years ago, I forgot how long ago, where all these countries were putting up targets for renewables, you know, 10%, 15%, and even China did, et cetera. And then Hong Kong came out with 1 or 2%, which, number one, is incredibly low, especially compared to what everybody else was doing. Number two, actually, 2% is double 1%. Mathematically, and I'm really bad in math. So it seemed a little bit light duty in terms of at least, you know, the policy, the direction, and Hong Kong going green, especially relative to some other cities in the region, like Singapore, to pick one.
Yeah, I think the 1 or 2% were based on whether we can get some small wind power stations, right?
Yeah,
you know, they didn't count the possibility of solar panels at the time because they didn't see the possibility of having, you know, solar farms of really any size. I think the learning has been, for many cities, that if you made a good hard push to do rooftops and, you know, other infrastructure that you have, you can really push the number up, right? So I think the 1 or 2% was based on just kind of offshore wind power. And Hong Kong does not have actually very rich wind resources, but they had not counted the solar. So in the more recent climate action plan, you will find the renewable energy, I think, has gone up to like 7 or 8%, which is kind of more more understandable. But how you're going to get there, we'll see how Hong Kong wants to get there. Hong Kong's major plan for clean power is to actually go buy more nuclear power for Hong Kong. Now, many people are unaware that approximately a quarter of Hong Kong's energy today comes from nuclear power from the Daya Bay plant on the mainland China side. Now, that's not a small amount if you look at the overall context. So one perspective for the government is, if they could look at buying more from China, can they go up to 50%, right, or maybe even more? How would they do that? And they talk about this. They said, well, perhaps we could even, again, invest in clean power across the border. So some of these discussions have to be taken between now and in the early 2030s, because Hong Kong has these long-term contracts between the government and the utility companies, right? So once they kind of agreed on what the next stage is, then the utilities would go and source the clean power from the mainland.
Professor Loh, I mean, clean energy is part of the path to net zero. You also got energy efficiency, and also you've got the sustainability side of things. And then if you look at, for example, I remember fondly being a service department in Shanghai or one in Beijing maybe a decade ago, and already had to kind of split all my rubbish, between plastic and paper, and this was a long time ago. Taiwan has been doing it for a long time. Japan they probably give you 25 rubbish bins, and you spend your whole evening not watching Netflix, but trying to work out which bin you should be using. In Hong Kong, it seems, and I'm just using rubbish as just one example, but as a society, or as a government that wants its society to be more sustainable, use more green resources, be more green in general, again, relative to Hong Kong's favorite comparison, which is Singapore, it seems a little bit behind. Do you see that that's likely to change in the coming years? And if not, why? And if so, why?
I think there are certain things that Singapore has done that are different from Hong Kong. Singapore has always been extremely practical about waste, and it's all about incineration. They have 5 incinerators, and Hong Kong doesn't have one yet, right? So Hong Kong's option, the final years of British rule, was the key issue to deal with waste was landfilling, whereas I think in Singapore was incineration. So you have 2 different trajectories, right? 2 different pathways. So for Hong Kong to go from in waste, landfilling, they actually have to build all kinds of infrastructure. And they're now in the process of just about finishing a first incinerator. What they have done is they've put in place a lot of other plants that have not yet been put in place in other economies. So Hong Kong has the largest sludge treatment plant, which also generates a lot of heat and therefore energy. And that energy is sold back to CLP, the power company. Electronic and electrical waste is also a major issue. But in total quantity, right, these are much smaller. They are problematic types of waste that needs different treatment, each one of them. They're not like plastics and paper where you're talking about tens of thousands of tons. So with electrical and electronic waste, we have a very, very nice plant in Hong Kong that deals with that. And they've worked out really how to charge people when you go and buy, refrigerators and computers, because you pay an extra charge up front to fund this particular plant. It's all very, very well done. People generally don't talk about that because I think most people don't know. Now, but we're at the stage where we're now also using co-digestion for organic waste, and we also have organic food waste plants and so on. So you're seeing bits of the infrastructure being built over time. Now, with all of these things, it's about whether you can collect it. Because before, you're just blending everything into your rubbish bin and throwing it in the landfill. Now you have to split things up and you have to find some scheme, right? So I think the most beautiful one is with electrical and electronic waste. The one that a lot of people don't know is the sludge treatment plant. And then we're now dealing with food waste plant, but collecting food waste is quite a challenge. Now, we always point to Taipei City and said, look, in Taipei they've done it really well, no doubt about that. But we need in Hong Kong to find our way of collecting food waste, and it's being trialed by government and so on. Now, in any case, I think the waste bit is very important. The savings, for energy savings, it's really important to save, because our energy is going to cost more. Now, the issue is saving means primarily for Hong Kong buildings, energy saving in buildings. It requires retrofitting buildings, and it requires users, people like you and me, to reduce and be very careful about the energy that we use.
The percentage of power used by building is ridiculous, like 60-70%.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it's really important to get that right. However, you require, again, the whole community to be with you on that. And the Hong Kong government seems to me to have a concern about thinking they don't want to regulate or impose anything on the general population that is a hassle. So if you look at Taipei, if you look at Seoul and Japan, they've developed a system where the ordinary citizen has to change their behavior, right? And in the Japanese case, they're asking Japanese people to separate so many different things, right? In Hong Kong, the government has been hesitant all these years to ask Hong Kong citizens to separate. So we don't have any laws to separate. So we might need to have laws to do that. So they're now creating a system where it's voluntary separation. They're trying to put a waste charge on what you throw away, because you have to pay. Hopefully you will now agree to separate, because if you separate it, you throw away less, so you don't have to pay, right? But that system, unfortunately, supposed to be operational this year, has been pushed back because, people sort of thought the government wasn't quite ready. But anyway, I won't go into the details of that. I think it's a pity, and I do think Hong Kong has to come back and do these things. But the mindset is, I don't want to trouble people to ask them to do things. So maybe this has to gradually change, because again, we're living in the world of sustainability. We do all have to make changes. And the education that is needed, the advocacy, the campaigning, the continuing campaigning to help people to understand what it is that they have to do and why, I think it's very important.
As compared to like Japanese or Singaporeans or Chinese, who are much more receptive to the government saying, you guys are going to change your behavior because it's good for you, it's good for society, it's good for the country. So,
well, different strokes for different folks. I'll share a story with you that I found really interesting. When I was in government and I had to go to an international meeting of municipal governments dealing with waste. And Hong Kong at the time was just thinking about how we were going to do it. So I didn't have much to say. I was there listening and learning. So they had somebody from Japan talking about, we've now worked with nearly 3 generations of our citizens to ask them to do all this very detailed separation. Then you have the Europeans. And I can't quite remember which country this official came from. But basically the answer was, well, we can't go as far as Japan, but we've gone quite a long way, to ask people to separate, and we separate quite a number of different types of waste, right? Okay. Then we had the official from, I think it was the city of Austin from Texas. And this official said, well, we can't ask Americans to do this. We have to do it all mechanically. It's got to be solved by technology, because we cannot ask Americans to do definitely not what the Japanese are able to do. We don't even think we can ask them to do what the Europeans are doing, right? So this is all got to be mechanical. So everything has to be thrown into just one or two bins, and then we take it somewhere, and the machines will have to do it, right? So in a way, that opened my mind to thinking, right, what kind of culture do you kind of come from? I mean, people's practices. If the Americans have to do that, well, what about us in Hong Kong, right? So just because we're Chinese, because we have maybe coming from a background where the government doesn't want to trouble the people, we are not able to do what the Japanese can do. And I did meet the gentleman, the official, who was the one responsible at the time for Taipei City to do waste separation. And he showed me a photograph. And the photograph was someone kind of like standing up talking, surrounded by a massive number of people. And he said to me in Chinese, which you will understand, he says, 这个就是我. And he was saying, the man standing there is me, right? And he says, this is a sea of people complaining to me about this stupid policy that we were going to put in place, right? And he said it was he said what he told me, because we in Hong Kong were trying to, right, get something going. And he says, I'm going to tell you that it'll be horrible for a long time. So when you implement, everybody will say you've done a bad job. But you got to keep going, and you got to show them, kind of what to do. And after a while, he said, things settle down, and then they'll say, oh, we know how to do it. So, and in 2019, I did observe, I was already out of government at the time, but I observed in Shanghai, that was the first city on the mainland to be asked to separate their waste and so on.
Very aggressively.
And at the time, for the first few months, I think they started like after the Spring Festival, after Chinese New Year. And for several months, in their WeChat, everybody uses WeChat in China, the biggest complaint in Shanghai was the government trying to impose the system, so complicated. Everybody was saying, I don't know what to do, right? Took 3 or 4 months, people kind of settled down, they know where to put stuff. And then everybody was feeling quite good about it. So you need to go through the experience. It's all experiential when you have to ask people to do something. So we need to be able, I think in Hong Kong, we need to kind of gut through that process, which we haven't done yet, unfortunately.
So just to summarize real quick, so for China, if we benchmark China versus other countries, on the clean energy side, we're definitely, personally, that's not what you're saying, but what I'm saying, it's the global leader.
Yeah, I think it's done very well. That's right. That's right. That's right.
And the pathway is pretty clear.
It's pretty clear.
Some countries have got kind of pathways, some countries don't. On the climate reporting side, China is getting there slowly but surely, progressing. And then we've got Hong Kong, which is kind of like in a altered state. trying to do, I mean, has planted some seeds, but not quite developed the
I think the thing about Hong Kong is we have both world-leading organizations and things that are not going so well. So we're always kind of a bit at the extreme. And in the middle, people are dragged towards, I think, the better side, but it's going to take time. Because I think we can improve on our alignment of policy, we can improve on our public messaging and campaigning and so on. And we need to step back from the concern of troubling our people. I think it's okay to get people on your side, but how you get them on your side does take a lot of work.
So you're optimistic, obviously, both about China, Hong Kong, I would say, or
I'm definitely. Well, to be honest, China is the 1,000-pound gorilla. Right. If China keeps going, it is going to be really helpful to the world. Because, and I think for China, because it's growing its renewable energy and clean energy so quickly, that you are going to see the Chinese consuming more and more clean energy. There'll be a point, which is the tipping point, where, fine, they've kind of gone over the top. They hopefully will not just plateau, but carbon emissions will start going down. And I think the Chinese, they're very good technicians, they're very good at calculating everything, they know what they need to do. So it's just how fast that they'll go. But they're near the top where they can start going down. And because it's so big, it really is very helpful. You know, Hong Kong will kind of be dragged along.
That's been my feeling as well, because, I mean, although Hong Kong is only 7.5 million people, next door country with 1.4 billion, if that country is doing so many things, sooner or later you're going to have to follow. The interesting thing, a couple of numbers about China, is that in the first half of this year, renewable energy contributed about 1,500 terawatt hours, 1,500. And Europe, the whole of last year, 1,500 is half a year. Europe, the whole of last year, was about 2,700, 2,800. So China is, on an annualized basis, is already surpassing the whole of the European production of electricity from gas, nuclear, everything, just with renewables.
Yeah.
Whereas a few years ago it was 0.0 nothing.
Yeah.
So I think that number is quite important as well.
I looking back at China, I think what we see is, the Chinese spell out what they're going to do. They keep going on it, and you can track them. So you see that they're starting very small, and then they keep growing, and then suddenly, boom, they're there. And people ask questions like EVs. How did they come from nowhere to suddenly being the dominant player in the world? So actually, the other thing about China, if you track what they're doing, you kind of see that once they cross a certain threshold, boom, they're there. And for people who haven't tracked what the Chinese are doing, they kind of think, how could you just burst on the scene? Well, actually, they didn't just burst on the scene. They've been working for more than a decade on certain things. But your tipping point in being big enough, only come at a certain stage. And from there, they grow very quickly, right? And they also build out their supply chain, because they know if you're going to make something, and if you're going to make it as efficiently as you can, you need to line up your entire supply chain. And this is why China is good at making things.
I 100% agree. Professor Loh, once again, thank you very, very much for your time. Lovely to see you in person here in Hong Kong. And I hope that you can be a guest to the Asian Climate Finance podcast again.
My privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Asia Climate Finance podcast. Please be advised that this podcast is presented for educational purposes only. None of the information provided should be construed in any way as investment advice. Always consult with a licensed investment professional before making any investment decisions. Additionally, please note that the views and opinions expressed by our guests are personal and may not reflect the views and opinions of their current or previous employers.